The stagecoach lurched to a violent halt outside the dusty town of Redemption, Texas, in the scorching summer of 1876, and Catherine Brennan gripped the wooden bench so hard her knuckles turned white as bone, her entire body trembling like a leaf caught in a windstorm as she stared through the cracked window at the unfamiliar landscape that would become her new home. She had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston, Massachusetts, leaving behind everything she had ever known to marry a man she had never met, a rancher named Thomas Whitmore, who had promised her a good life in his carefully worded letters that now felt like distant dreams tucked inside her worn leather satchel. The driver yanked open the door, and Catherine forced her shaking legs to carry her down the steps, her practical gray traveling dress coated in a thick layer of red dust that seemed to cover everything in this harsh, unforgiving land. The Texas heat slammed into her like a physical force, so different from the cool New England summers she had grown up with, and she swayed slightly on her feet, her vision blurring at the edges as the reality of what she had done finally crashed over her like a tidal wave. "Miss Brennan." A rough voice cut through her panic, and she looked up to see a man approaching, but he was not alone, and something in his expression made her blood run cold. Thomas Whitmore was shorter than she had imagined, with a thick mustache and cold, calculating eyes that swept over her like she was livestock at auction. Behind him stood two other men, and the way they watched her made her skin crawl with an instinctive fear she could not name. "Yes, I am Catherine Brennan," she managed to say, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, and she could not stop the violent trembling that had taken hold of her entire body. Something was terribly wrong. She could feel it in her bones, in the way Thomas looked at her without warmth, in the way the other men smirked and exchanged knowing glances. "You are smaller than I expected," Thomas said, his tone flat and businesslike. "But you will do, come along now. We have business to attend to before the ceremony." He reached for her arm, and Catherine instinctively stepped back, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "I thought we would have time to speak first, to become acquainted," she said, trying to keep her voice steady even as her hands shook uncontrollably. "Your letters said—" "Letters say a lot of things," Thomas interrupted, and his smile did not reach his eyes. "But this is Texas, Miss Brennan, and things work differently here. Now stop making a fuss and come with me." Catherine's fear crystallized into something sharper, more primal. She had been foolish, so desperately foolish, to come here alone with no one to protect her. No family to vouch for this man who now seemed like a complete stranger wearing the mask of the gentle rancher who had written those letters. She wondered suddenly if he had even written them himself, or if someone else had penned those kind words just to lure her across the country. "I need a moment," she said, backing away further, her eyes darting around the dusty street looking for help, for anyone who might intervene. The few townspeople who had been watching quickly turned away, their expressions carefully neutral, and Catherine realized with growing horror that no one was going to help her. Thomas's expression hardened. "You are making this difficult, and I do not appreciate difficult women." He moved toward her again, faster this time, and Catherine did the only thing she could think of. She turned and ran. Her boots pounded against the hard-packed earth as she fled down the main street of Redemption, her skirts clutched in her fists, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear Thomas shouting behind her, could hear the footsteps of the other men giving chase, and terror gave her speed she did not know she possessed. She had no idea where she was going, no plan beyond the desperate need to escape, to find somewhere safe, to find someone who would help her. She rounded a corner and slammed directly into something solid. Strong hands caught her arms, steadying her, and Catherine looked up into the face of the tallest man she had ever seen. He had dark hair that fell past his collar, sun-bronzed skin, and eyes the color of a summer storm, gray-blue and intense, studying her with immediate concern. "Please," Catherine gasped, her whole body shaking so violently she could barely stand. "Please help me. I do not know what to do. I came here to marry a man, but something is wrong. Everything is wrong, and I am so frightened." The cowboy's expression shifted from surprise to something harder, more protective. His hands on her arms were gentle but firm, grounding her when she felt like she might fly apart from fear. "You are safe now, I promise you," he said, his voice low and steady, and something in his tone made Catherine believe him despite having just met him mere seconds ago. Thomas and his companions rounded the corner, coming to an abrupt halt when they saw Catherine standing with the tall stranger. Thomas's face flushed an ugly red. "McAllister, this is none of your concern. The woman is my mail-order bride, legally contracted, and she is coming with me." The man holding Catherine's arms, McAllister, did not release her. Instead, he positioned himself slightly in front of her, creating a barrier between her and Thomas with his body. "Is that true, miss? Did you agree to marry this man?" Catherine's mind raced. She had agreed, had signed papers and traveled all this way. But everything felt wrong now, tainted by Thomas's coldness and the fear that had gripped her the moment she saw him. "I agreed to marry a man named Thomas Whitmore based on his letters," she said carefully, finding strength in McAllister's steady presence. "But the man who wrote those letters would not have frightened me like this. Something is not right." "She is just nervous," Thomas said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone that sounded false to Catherine's ears. "All brides get nervous. This is none of your business, McAllister. Hand her over and we will forget about this incident." "I do not think I will," McAllister said, and there was steel in his voice now. "The lady is clearly distressed, and until she feels comfortable proceeding, she stays with me." "You are interfering with a legal contract," one of Thomas's companions said, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. McAllister's stance shifted almost imperceptibly, but Catherine felt the change in him, felt the coiled readiness in his body. "You really want to draw on me, Hayes, because we both know how that will end." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and Catherine found herself holding her breath, terrified that violence was about to erupt because of her. But after a long moment, Thomas held up his hand, stopping his companion from drawing his weapon. "This is not over," Thomas said coldly. "That woman owes me money for her passage for the contract between us. She cannot just run away because she is scared of her own shadow." He pointed at Catherine. "You think McAllister here is some kind of hero? He is just a drifter, a man with nothing to his name. At least I can provide for you, give you a home. A home where she is terrified before she even crosses the threshold." McAllister's voice was quiet but cutting. "That does not sound like much of a home to me." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "She has 3 days. 3 days to pay back the money I spent bringing her here, or the contract stands and she marries me whether she likes it or not. That is Texas law, McAllister, and not even you can stand against that." With that, he turned and stalked away, his companions following, though they cast dark looks over their shoulders. Catherine felt her legs finally give out, and McAllister caught her easily, supporting her weight as if she weighed nothing at all. "Easy now," he murmured. "You are all right." "I have got you." "I do not have that kind of money," Catherine whispered, despair washing over her now that the immediate danger had passed. "I spent everything I had just to eat during the journey here. I have perhaps $5 to my name, and I doubt that will even begin to cover what he paid for my passage." McAllister's jaw tightened. "How much did he say it cost?" $80. He mentioned it in his last letter." Catherine closed her eyes, fighting back tears. She would not cry, not here in the street where everyone could see. She had been foolish to come here, foolish to believe that a stranger's kind letters could lead to a better life. Now she was trapped in a town where she knew no one, with no money and no way to return home. "Come on," McAllister said gently. "Let me get you somewhere you can sit down and catch your breath. Then we will figure this out." He guided her down the street to a small restaurant, his hand light on her back, steadying her when she stumbled. The few townspeople they passed watched with open curiosity, and Catherine knew that by nightfall, Everyone in Redemption would know about the mail-order bride who had run from Thomas Whitmore straight into the arms of James McAllister. Inside the restaurant, McAllister led her to a corner table and pulled out a chair for her. A woman in her 50s approached, her expression kind and concerned. "James, what is going on? This young lady looks about ready to collapse." "Some water, please, Martha. And maybe some of that stew if you have any left." McAllister sat down across from Catherine, his long legs stretched out beneath the small table. "This is Miss Catherine Brennan, newly arrived from Boston. She came to marry Thomas Whitmore." Martha's expression shifted to one of sympathy and understanding. "Oh, honey, I am so sorry. If I had known Thomas was sending for a bride, I would have tried to warn you somehow." She hurried away and returned quickly with a glass of cool water and a bowl of thick beef stew that smelled wonderful despite Catherine's roiling stomach. "Drink slowly," McAllister advised, and Catherine obeyed, letting the cool water soothe her parched throat. Her hands were still trembling, but the shaking had subsided somewhat now that she was sitting down and no longer running for her life. "Why would you need to warn me?" Catherine asked, looking between Martha and McAllister. "What is wrong with Thomas Whitmore?" Martha glanced at McAllister, who nodded slightly. She sat down at their table, her voice low. "Thomas Whitmore is not a good man. He has been through 3 wives in the last 10 years. The first died in what he called an accident. The second ran off in the middle of the night and was never seen again. The third died in childbirth, though the baby died too, which seemed suspicious to those of us who knew her." Catherine felt ice spread through her veins. "You think he murdered them?" "I think," Martha said carefully, "that Thomas Whitmore sees women as property to be used and discarded when they are no longer useful. I think you are very lucky that you ran into James when you did." Catherine turned to look at McAllister properly for the first time since he had saved her. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps only 26 or 27, with strong features and those remarkable gray-blue eyes that watched her with a mixture of concern and something else she could not quite identify. There was a quiet strength about him, a steadiness that made her feel safe even though she barely knew him. "Thank you," she said softly. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not been there." "Do not thank me yet," McAllister said, his expression troubled. "We still have to figure out how to get you out of this contract without getting you arrested or worse. Thomas was not lying about Texas law. If you cannot pay back the money he spent on your passage, you are legally obligated to fulfill the marriage contract. Could I work to pay it off?" Catherine asked desperately. "I can cook and clean, I can sew. Surely someone in town needs help." Martha shook her head sadly. $80 would take you months to earn, and Thomas is not going to give you months. He wants you married to him in 3 days. Then what do I do?" Catherine heard the panic rising in her voice again. "I cannot marry him. I would rather die than marry a man who frightens me like that, who may have hurt his previous wives." "You are not going to die, and you are not going to marry Thomas Whitmore," McAllister said firmly. "I will pay your debt." Catherine stared at him in shock. "What? No, I cannot let you do that. $80 is a fortune. I could never pay you back." "I am not asking you to pay me back." McAllister's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if he had not just offered to hand over a sum of money that would take most men months to earn. "But why?" Catherine could not understand this. "You do not even know me. Why would you spend so much money on a complete stranger?" McAllister was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. "Because I know Thomas Whitmore, and I know what kind of man he is. Because no woman should be forced into a marriage that terrifies her. And because—" he paused, seeming to struggle with something. "Because the moment I saw the fear in your eyes, I knew I could not walk away and let him hurt you. Call it instinct or foolishness, but that is the truth." Martha smiled softly and patted Catherine's hand. "James is a good man, honey, one of the best I have ever known. If he says he will help you, he means it." Catherine felt tears burning in her eyes, overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers when she had been prepared for cruelty. "I do not know what to say." "Say you will eat that stew before it gets cold." McAllister said with a small smile. And then we will go find Thomas and settle this debt once and for all. Catherine ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her mind racing with everything that had happened in the last hour. Her entire life had been upended, all her careful plans shattered, and yet somehow she felt safer sitting in this small restaurant with James McAllister than she had felt in months. When she finished, McAllister stood and offered her his hand. Ready. Catherine took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. As ready as I will ever be. They walked together back into the brutal afternoon heat, and Catherine was acutely aware of McAllister's presence beside her, tall and solid and reassuring. He led her to a building with a sign that read, Whitmore Cattle Company, and Catherine realized with a jolt that Thomas was not just a rancher. He apparently owned one of the larger businesses in town. Inside, they found Thomas sitting behind a large desk, clearly expecting them. So you have come to your senses, he said to Catherine, ignoring McAllister entirely. I have come to pay off Miss Brennan's debt, McAllister said, pulling a leather pouch from his jacket. $80, which is what you claim you spent on her passage. Thomas's eyes narrowed. The debt is not yours to pay, McAllister. Miss Brennan has assigned it to me. That is legal under Texas law as well. McAllister counted out the money in gold coins, stacking them precisely on the desk. There, the debt is paid. Miss Brennan is free of any obligation to you. For a moment, Catherine thought Thomas was going to refuse the money, was going to find some loophole or technicality to keep her trapped. But finally, he swept the coins into his drawer with an angry motion. Fine, the debt is paid, he glared at Catherine. But you have made a grave mistake, Miss Brennan. James McAllister might seem like your savior now, but he is nothing. He has no ranch, no business, no prospects. When he tires of playing hero and you find yourself alone and penniless in a town where everyone knows you shamed a prominent businessman, do not come crawling back to me. Catherine lifted her chin, finding courage in McAllister's steady presence beside her. I would rather be alone and penniless than married to a man I fear. Thomas's face darkened with rage, but before he could respond, McAllister took Catherine's elbow and guided her out of the office. Once they were back in the street, Catherine let out a shaky breath she had not realized she was holding. Is it really over? She asked. Am I truly free of him? You are free, McAllister confirmed. He might bluster and make threats, but the debt is paid and the contract is void. He has no legal claim on you anymore. Relief flooded through Catherine, so intense it made her dizzy. But on the heels of relief came a new worry. He was right about one thing, though. I am alone and penniless in a town where I know no one. I do not even have anywhere to sleep tonight. McAllister was quiet for a moment, and Catherine could see him thinking, working through the problem. Martha and her husband John own that restaurant. They also own the boarding house next door. I am sure she would give you a room and let you work off the cost until you figure out what you want to do next. And what about you? Catherine asked, then immediately felt her cheeks flush. I mean, you just spent $80 on me. That is a tremendous sum. How will you manage? McAllister's expression was unreadable. I will be fine. That money was meant for something else, but nothing as important as making sure you are safe. Catherine felt something twist in her chest. This man had sacrificed his own plans, his own savings, to rescue a woman he did not even know. The contrast between him and Thomas Whitmore could not have been more stark. They walked to the boarding house, and Martha was delighted to give Catherine a small but clean room on the second floor. You can help me with cooking and cleaning, Martha said. It will be nice to have another woman around the place. Most of my boarders are cowboys and ranch hands, and they are a messy lot. That night, Catherine lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind too full for sleep. She thought about Boston, about the life she had left behind. The cramped apartment she had shared with her ailing mother until she died, the factory work that had barely kept them fed, the loneliness that had driven her to answer Thomas Whitmore's advertisement seeking a wife. She had thought she was escaping to something better. But instead she had nearly walked into a nightmare. And then she thought about James McAllister, about the way he had stood between her and danger without hesitation, about the calm certainty in his voice when he promised she was safe. She barely knew him, and yet he had changed the entire course of her life in a single afternoon. The next morning, Catherine woke early and helped Martha prepare breakfast for the boarders. The work was familiar and comforting, giving her something to focus on besides the chaos of her situation. The boarding house residents were a mixed group: cowboys, drifters, a traveling salesman, and a schoolteacher. And they treated her with polite respect, though she caught several curious glances. She was clearing plates when the door opened and James McAllister walked in. Her heart gave an unexpected leap at the sight of him, and she told herself firmly that it was just gratitude, nothing more. "Morning, James," Martha called from the kitchen. "Your usual, please." McAllister sat down at a corner table and his eyes found Catherine's. "How are you settling in?" Catherine carried a cup of coffee over to him, grateful for an excuse to talk. "Well, thank you. Martha and John have been very kind." She hesitated, then added, "I wanted to thank you again for what you did. I know I already said it, but it does not feel like enough." "You do not owe me anything," McAllister said, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup. "I am just glad you are safe." "Can I ask you something?" Catherine sat down across from him, propriety be damned. She needed to understand this man who had upended her life. "Why do you have such enmity with Thomas Whitmore? It seemed personal yesterday." McAllister's expression darkened. "Thomas and I have history. 5 years ago, my younger sister Mary came to Redemption to work as a teacher. She was 18, bright and full of hope. Thomas took an interest in her, and I tried to warn her away, but she thought she knew better. She thought he was a respectable businessman, and I was just an overprotective brother." Catherine felt her stomach drop. "What happened?" "They courted for a few months. He was charming, attentive, everything a young woman could want. Then one night, Mary came to me bruised and terrified. Thomas had shown his true colors, had hurt her when she refused something he wanted. I got her out of town that same night, sent her back east to live with our aunt." McAllister's jaw was tight with old anger. "I stayed behind, hoping to see Thomas face justice, but he claimed Mary had fallen off a horse. The sheriff was in Thomas's pocket, so nothing came of it." "I am so sorry," Catherine said softly. "Is your sister all right now?" "She is married to a good man in Virginia. She has a child and seems happy." McAllister met Catherine's eyes. "But I have never forgotten what Thomas did to her. When I saw you running from him yesterday, so frightened you could barely stand, it was like seeing Mary all over again. I could not let him hurt another woman the way he hurt my sister." Understanding bloomed in Catherine's chest. McAllister had not just been helping a stranger. He had been protecting someone who reminded him of his sister, preventing history from repeating itself. "Your sister is lucky to have a brother who loves her so much. I failed her once. I was not going to fail again." McAllister's voice was rough with emotion, and Catherine suddenly wanted very badly to reach across the table and take his hand, to offer comfort the way he had comforted her. Before she could act on the impulse, Martha emerged from the kitchen with a plate of eggs and bacon. "Here you go, James. Catherine, honey, could you help me with the bread? The oven is being temperamental again." Catherine reluctantly rose and followed Martha into the kitchen, but she found her thoughts drifting back to the man at the corner table throughout the morning. There was something about James McAllister that drew her, something beyond gratitude. He was quiet where Thomas had been boastful, gentle where Thomas had been rough, genuine where Thomas had been false. Over the next few days, Catherine fell into a routine at the boarding house. She cooked and cleaned, helped Martha with laundry and mending, and slowly began to feel less like a frightened refugee and more like a person with purpose. The work was hard but honest, and Martha and John treated her like family rather than an employee. James came by every morning for breakfast and often returned in the evening for dinner. Catherine learned that he worked as a ranch hand at a spread several miles outside of town, breaking horses and repairing fences, doing whatever work needed doing. He was saving money, he told her one evening, to buy his own piece of land someday. "Is that what the $80 was for?" Catherine asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I am sorry, that is none of my business," but James did not seem offended. "Part of it, yes. I had been saving for 2 years to buy a section of land near the river. Good grazing, a water source, everything I would need to start a small ranch of my own." Guilt twisted in Catherine's stomach. "And I took that dream away from you." "No." James's voice was firm. "I chose to use that money to help you, and I would make the same choice again. The land will still be there, I can save again, but I could not let Thomas hurt you." "You are a good man, James McAllister," Catherine said softly, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Something shifted in James's expression, something warm and uncertain. "You are making it very difficult for me to maintain proper distance, Miss Brennan," Catherine's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean," James said slowly, carefully, "that I find myself thinking about you far more than is appropriate for a woman I barely know. I mean that every time I see you smile, it feels like the sun coming out from behind clouds. I mean that I want to spend time with you not just to make sure you are safe, but because I enjoy your company." Catherine's heart was racing. She should have been frightened by this confession, should have been wary after what had nearly happened with Thomas. But what she felt was the opposite of fear. "I think about you too," she admitted. "More than I should." "Then perhaps," James said, his gray-blue eyes searching hers, "we should stop fighting it. I know the circumstances are strange, and the timing is probably terrible, but I would like to court you properly, Catherine, if you would allow it." Catherine thought about everything that had happened since she arrived in Redemption. She had come here expecting to marry a stranger, only to discover that the stranger was a monster. But in fleeing from that fate, she had found something entirely unexpected, a man who saw her as more than property, who had sacrificed for her, who made her feel safe and valued and seen. "I would like that very much," she said, and the smile that broke across James's face was like watching the dawn. From that day forward, their relationship changed. James still came for meals, but now he lingered afterward, and they would walk through town together in the evening cool, talking about everything and nothing. Catherine learned that James loved horses, that he had grown up in Oklahoma before drifting to Texas, that his favorite food was apple pie and he could not carry a tune to save his life. James learned that Catherine had taught herself to read from discarded newspapers, that she had always dreamed of having a garden of her own, that she missed the ocean even though she had only seen it a handful of times. The town watched their growing romance with interest. Some seemed pleased, particularly Martha and John, who clearly approved of James. Others were less kind, spreading rumors that Catherine was a loose woman who had shamed Thomas Whitmore. Thomas himself glowered whenever he saw them together, but he kept his distance, perhaps wary of pushing James too far. One evening, about 3 weeks after Catherine had arrived in Redemption, James took her to a hill just outside of town where they could watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. They sat together on a fallen log, and Catherine was acutely aware of the warmth of James's body beside hers, of the way his shoulder pressed against hers. "I need to tell you something," James said, his voice serious. "I heard today that the land I wanted to buy, the section near the river, is being sold to someone else. They accepted another offer." Catherine's heart sank. "Oh, James, I am so sorry. I know how much you wanted that land." "I was disappointed at first," James admitted. "But then I realized something. I had been so focused on that specific piece of land, on that specific dream, that I had not considered that maybe there are other dreams worth having. Better dreams." "What do you mean?" James turned to face her fully, taking both of her hands in his. "Catherine Brennan, I know we have not known each other long. By all rights, I should wait months more before saying what I am about to say. But life is uncertain, and I have learned that sometimes you have to take chances on the things that matter." Catherine's pulse was thundering in her ears. "James, "I am in love with you," James said, his voice steady and sure. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you looked up at me with those frightened eyes and asked for help, and every day since then I have fallen a little bit deeper. You are brave and kind and resilient. You make me laugh, you make me want to be a better man, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks, but they were good tears, happy tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "I did not think I could feel this way, not after what almost happened with Thomas. But you showed me what kindness looks like, what real caring looks like. You make me feel safe and cherished and alive." James reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. "Then marry me, Catherine, not because of a contract or an obligation, but because we choose each other. Because we love each other." "Yes," Catherine said, and then again, louder, "Yes, I will marry you, James McAllister." James pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Catherine felt like she had finally come home. She had traveled 2,000 miles expecting one future, only to find something infinitely better. In James's embrace, she was not a mail-order bride or a woman fleeing danger. She was simply Catherine, loved and loving in return. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, with Martha and John standing as witnesses. Catherine wore a simple blue dress that Martha had helped her sew, and James wore his best shirt and pants, his dark hair neatly combed. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when James kissed her, Catherine felt joy so complete it almost frightened her with its intensity. They moved into a small house at the edge of town that John helped them rent cheaply. It was just 3 rooms and in need of repair, but to Catherine it was a palace. She scrubbed the floors and hung curtains while James fixed the leaking roof and replaced broken boards. At night they lay together in their small bed, talking in whispers, learning each other's bodies with gentle reverence. Catherine had worried that her past, the near miss with Thomas, the fear she had felt, might make intimacy difficult. But James was patient and tender, never pushing, always making sure she felt safe. And gradually, Catherine discovered that physical love could be beautiful when it was given freely between 2 people who cared for each other. The months passed, and their life together settled into a comfortable rhythm. Catherine continued to help Martha at the boarding house several days a week, saving every penny she could. James kept working at the ranch, and slowly their savings grew. They dreamed together about the future, about the land they would buy someday, the ranch they would build, the family they hoped to have. Thomas Whitmore remained a dark presence in town, and Catherine sometimes caught him watching her with cold, hateful eyes. But he never approached her directly, and James made sure Catherine was never alone when she went into town. The shadow of what might have been hung over them sometimes, a reminder of how close Catherine had come to a terrible fate. Then, 6 months after their wedding, everything changed. Catherine was at the boarding house helping Martha prepare dinner when the door burst open and a cowboy stumbled in, his face pale and frightened. "There has been an accident at the Whitmore Ranch, a fire in the barn. Several men are hurt, maybe dead." Catherine's blood ran cold. James had mentioned that morning that he might pick up some extra work at the Whitmore Ranch, as his regular boss had given him the day off. "Was James McAllister there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The cowboy shook his head. "I do not know, ma'am. It was chaos. The whole barn went up like kindling." Catherine did not remember leaving the boarding house or running through the streets toward the Whitmore Ranch. She just knew she had to get there, had to find James, had to know he was safe. Martha's voice called after her, but Catherine did not stop. The Whitmore Ranch was 2 miles outside of town, and Catherine ran the entire way, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She could see the smoke long before she reached the property, a black column rising into the clear blue sky. When she finally arrived, she found chaos, men shouting, horses panicking, and the barn reduced to a burning skeleton. "James!" Catherine screamed, looking frantically around. "James McAllister, Mrs. McAllister." One of the ranch hands approached, his face streaked with soot. "Your husband is over there. He is all right, just some burns on his hands." Relief so intense it made her knees weak flooded through Catherine. She ran toward where the man had pointed and found James sitting on the ground, another man bandaging his hands. His face was blackened with smoke, and she could see angry red burns on his palms, but he was alive, he was whole. "Catherine," James looked up in surprise. "What are you doing here? I heard there was a fire, that men were hurt. I had to make sure you were all right." Catherine dropped to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face. "Are you badly hurt?" "Just my hands. I pulled some men out of the barn before it collapsed." James looked exhausted but calm. "It could have been much worse. How did the fire start?" Catherine asked, and even as she said it, she saw Thomas Whitmore standing across the yard watching them. There was something in his expression that made her uneasy. The ranch hand who was bandaging James's hands said quietly, "Some folks are saying it was deliberate. Someone locked the barn doors from the outside right before the fire started." If James had not been close enough to hear the men shouting and break the doors down, they all would have died. Catherine felt ice settle in her stomach. Who would do such a thing? But she already knew. Thomas had been furious when she chose James over him, when James had humiliated him by paying off her debt. Thomas was the kind of man who held grudges, who saw people as possessions to be controlled. Over the next few days, as James recovered from his burns, rumors swirled through Redemption. The sheriff investigated the fire and declared it accidental, but many people did not believe that verdict. The ranch hands who had been trapped in the barn swore someone had locked them in. They had heard footsteps outside right before the flames started. Then, a week after the fire, one of Thomas's former employees came forward with a stunning confession. The man, a ranch hand named Billy Parker, who had been fired the previous month, told the sheriff that Thomas had paid him to start the fire. The plan had been to trap the workers inside, creating a tragedy that would look like an accident. Thomas had not known that James would be nearby and would save the trapped men. The reason for the fire, Billy said, was that Thomas wanted to collect insurance money. The Whitmore Cattle Company was failing, drowning in debts that Thomas had hidden from everyone. The fire was supposed to provide an influx of cash to keep the business afloat. The revelation shocked the town. The sheriff had no choice but to arrest Thomas, despite his protests and claims that Billy was lying. The trial was swift, and the evidence damning. Thomas was found guilty of arson and attempted murder and sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison. On the day Thomas was taken away, Catherine stood with James on the main street of Redemption and watched the wagon carry him off. "It is really over," she said softly. "He cannot hurt anyone anymore." James wrapped his bandaged hand carefully around hers. "You were brave to come here even knowing the risks, and you were brave to run when you sensed danger. I am proud of you, Catherine." Catherine leaned against her husband, feeling the solid strength of him, the safety he represented. "I did not know what I was running toward, only what I was running from. But I am so grateful I ran straight into you." With Thomas gone and the Whitmore Cattle Company dissolved, Redemption began to heal. The land that Thomas had owned was put up for auction to pay his debts, and James and Catherine attended the sale with hope beating in their chests, and their combined savings clutched in James's pocket. When the section of land near the river, the same land James had wanted to buy before, came up for bid, James raised his hand. Other bidders dropped out one by one as the price climbed until finally the auctioneer called "sold," and the land was theirs. Catherine could hardly believe it as they signed the papers. After everything they had been through, they finally had their dream within reach. They owned 160 acres of good Texas grazing land with a river running through it, enough space to build a house and start a small cattle operation. They spent the next year working harder than Catherine had ever worked in her life. With help from John and some of the ranch hands James had saved from the fire, they built a small but sturdy house, just 3 rooms to start, but with plans to add on as they could afford it. They dug a well, built a barn, and constructed fences. James bought their first cattle with money he had saved, just a dozen head to start, but it was a beginning. Catherine planted the garden she had always dreamed of, putting in vegetables and herbs and even some flowers that Martha gave her as cuttings. She learned to cook over a wood stove, to preserve food for the winter, to make soap and candles. The work was exhausting, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way her factory work in Boston had never been. At night, she and James would sit on their small porch and watch the sun set over their land, and Catherine would sometimes marvel at how drastically her life had changed. She had come to Texas expecting to marry a stranger, only to flee that fate and instead find true love with a man who saw her as an equal partner. "What are you thinking about?" James asked one evening, pulling her close against his side. "I am thinking about how different everything is from what I expected," Catherine said. "I thought I would be stuck in a loveless marriage, making the best of a bad situation. Instead, I have this, a home, a partner, a purpose. I have you." James kissed the top of her head. "I never expected to fall in love so quickly. I always thought I would marry eventually, but it would be a practical arrangement, companionship more than passion. Then you stumbled into my life, shaking and terrified, and everything changed." "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked quietly. "Giving up your savings for me, this year of hard work to get back to where you were? Never." James's voice was fierce. "I would do it again in a heartbeat. You are worth more than all the land in Texas, Catherine McAllister." Catherine turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. She had come to Texas alone and frightened, but she had found something precious. A true partner, a real home, a love that was freely given and freely received. As their first year on the ranch turned into their second, their herd grew and their house expanded. James proved to be a skilled rancher with a gift for raising cattle, and Catherine managed their household with efficiency and care. They hired a young cowboy named Pete to help with the heavier work, and Catherine enjoyed having someone else to cook for, someone to mother a bit since Pete was only 19 and far from his own family. Then, in the spring of their second year on the ranch, Catherine realized she was pregnant. She told James one evening after dinner, her hands shaking with excitement and nervousness. "I think we are going to have a baby." James stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Catherine felt a flutter of worry. But then a slow, wondering smile spread across his face. "A baby, Catherine, are you sure?" "I am sure. I am about 3 months along, I think." Catherine took his hands. "Are you happy?" "Happy." James pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she were made of glass. "I am thrilled, terrified but thrilled. We are going to be parents." Over the next months, Catherine's belly swelled, and James fussed over her constantly, trying to keep her from doing heavy work even though Catherine insisted she was perfectly capable. Martha came out to the ranch regularly to check on Catherine and offer advice, having raised 3 children of her own. "You are going to be a wonderful mother," Martha told Catherine one afternoon as they sat shelling peas on the porch. "You have been through so much, and you have come through it all with grace and strength. That baby is lucky to have you." Catherine rested her hand on her rounded belly, feeling the baby move beneath her palm. "I hope so. I never thought I would have this, a husband I love, a home of my own, a child. After my mother died, I thought I would spend my life alone, working in factories until I was too old to work anymore." "Life has a way of surprising us," Martha said wisely. "Sometimes the paths we think we are supposed to walk turn out to be wrong, and the detours lead us to where we are really meant to be." In late autumn, when the Texas heat had finally broken into cooler weather, Catherine went into labor. James rode hard into town to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson who had delivered half the babies in Redemption. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, but finally Catherine heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. "It is a boy, Mrs. Henderson announced, cleaning the squalling infant and wrapping him in a soft blanket before placing him in Catherine's arms. A big, healthy boy. Catherine looked down at her son, at his tiny red face and flailing fists, and felt love so fierce it took her breath away. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." James sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around Catherine, staring at their son with open wonder. "He is perfect. What should we name him?" Catherine had been thinking about this for months. "I would like to name him Thomas." James looked at her in surprise. "After?" "No, not after Thomas Whitmore," Catherine said quickly. "After my father. His name was Thomas Brennan, and he died when I was very small. I barely remember him, but my mother always said he was a good man who loved us very much. I would like our son to carry his name." James's expression softened. "Thomas McAllister. I think that is perfect." Little Thomas thrived, growing from a tiny bundle into a chubby, cheerful baby who seemed fascinated by everything around him. Catherine had never known she could feel such love, such protectiveness. She understood now why women would do anything for their children, would face any danger or hardship to keep them safe. As Thomas grew, the ranch continued to prosper. Their herd numbered nearly 50 head now, and they had expanded the house to include 2 more rooms, one for Thomas, and one that served as a proper parlor for receiving the rare guests who made the journey out to their property. James hired another cowboy to help Pete, and Catherine sometimes took on extra sewing work from town to add to their savings. When Thomas was 2 years old, Catherine found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and she gave birth to a daughter they named Mary, after James's sister. Little Mary had her father's gray-blue eyes and her mother's dark hair, and she was quieter than Thomas had been, content to watch the world with solemn observation. The years flowed by in a rhythm of work and love and family. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to ride almost before he could walk properly. Mary was gentler, preferring to help Catherine in the garden or with the cooking. They added a third child, another boy they named John after John, who ran the boarding house and had been so kind to them, and then finally a fourth, a daughter they named Martha. Catherine sometimes stood on the porch of their now substantial house and looked out over the ranch they had built together, at the children playing in the yard, at James working with the horses in the corral, and she felt gratitude so deep it almost hurt. She thought about the frightened woman who had arrived in Redemption all those years ago, shaking so hard she could barely stand, and she barely recognized herself in that memory. She had come to Texas expecting duty and obligation, a marriage arranged by letters and contracts. Instead, she had found love, real, deep, enduring love that had carried her through hardship and fear, and had blossomed into this rich, full life. One evening, when the children were all finally asleep and she and James sat together on the porch watching the stars come out, Catherine said, "Do you remember the day we met?" James smiled. "How could I forget? You ran into me so hard you nearly knocked us both over. I thought you were being chased by bandits from the look on your face." "I was terrified," Catherine admitted. "Everything felt wrong and I did not know what to do, and then you were there and you said those words that changed everything." "What words?" James asked, though Catherine suspected he knew. "You said, 'You are safe now, I promise you,' and I believed you. I do not know why, but I believed you completely." Catherine took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "And you kept that promise, James. Every day for all these years, you have kept me safe. Not just physically, but emotionally. You made me feel valued and loved and cherished." "You did the same for me," James said softly. "I was drifting before I met you, working and saving but without any real purpose. You gave me something to work toward, someone to build a life with. You made me want to be the best version of myself." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the rustle of the wind through the grass, the distant howl of a coyote. After a while, James said, "I heard some news in town today. Thomas Whitmore was released from prison last month. He apparently moved to California to start over. Catherine felt a brief flutter of old fear, but it passed quickly. Thomas Whitmore could not hurt her anymore. She was not the helpless, frightened woman who had arrived in redemption. She was Catherine McAllister, a rancher's wife, a mother, a woman who had built a life through hard work and determination and love. "I hope he finds peace," she said, and meant it. "I hope he learns to be better than he was. That is generous of you. I am happy, James, truly, deeply happy. And I think part of that happiness comes from letting go of anger and fear. Thomas Whitmore tried to hurt me, but he failed. Instead, running from him led me straight to you, to this life, to our family. In a strange way, I am almost grateful to him for being exactly what he was, because it forced me to see what real goodness looks like." James pulled her close, and Catherine rested her head on his shoulder, feeling safe and loved and home. They had built something lasting here in the Texas wilderness, something that would outlive them and carry on through their children and grandchildren. They had built a legacy of love. As the years continued to pass, the McAllister Ranch became one of the most respected spreads in the county. James and Catherine were known for their fairness to their workers, the quality of their cattle, and their generosity to neighbors in need. When drought struck one summer, they shared their water with nearby ranchers. When a winter storm devastated a neighbor's herd, James and his sons helped round up the surviving cattle. Thomas, their eldest, grew into a fine young man with his father's steady nature and his mother's quick mind. He married a rancher's daughter from the next county, a spirited woman named Elena, and brought her home to the ranch. James and Catherine built them a small house on the far edge of the property, and soon enough, grandchildren began to arrive. Mary became a teacher in redemption, taking over from the elderly woman who had taught for decades. She loved learning and books, and she never married, content with her independence and her work. Catherine worried sometimes that Mary was lonely, but Mary assured her mother that she was happy, that teaching gave her life purpose and meaning. John followed in his father's footsteps, with a natural gift for working with horses. He started a horse breeding program on the ranch that became famous throughout Texas, and buyers came from hundreds of miles away to purchase McAllister horses. Martha, the youngest, was the wild one, always getting into scrapes and adventures. She had her mother's courage and her father's stubbornness, and Catherine saw herself in Martha's fierce independence. Martha eventually married a lawyer from Dallas and moved to the growing city, though she visited the ranch often with her own children. As Catherine and James grew older, they gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Thomas and John. They spent their days working in the garden, playing with grandchildren, and sitting on the porch in the evening cool. Catherine's hair turned gray, then white, and James moved with less ease, his joints stiff from decades of hard work. But the love between them never dimmed. One evening, when they were both in their 60s, Catherine said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had not run that day? If I had gone through with marrying Thomas Whitmore?" James was quiet for a long moment. "I try not to think about it. The idea of you trapped with that man, hurt or worse, I cannot bear it." "I do not think I would have survived," Catherine said softly. "Not physically, maybe, but I would not have survived as myself. He would have broken something essential in me." She took James's weathered hand. "But I did run, I found you, and we built this beautiful life together." "We did," James agreed, "though there were days I was not sure we would make it. That first year on the ranch, when the money was so tight and we worked from dawn until long after dark. Or when Thomas was born and you were so sick afterward. Or during the drought when we thought we might lose everything. But we did not lose everything," Catherine said. "We held on. We fought for this life for each other, and that is what made it so precious." James lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Catherine McAllister. I have loved you from the moment you crashed into my life, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Catherine replied, tears shining in her eyes. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved." More years passed, and Catherine watched her children and grandchildren grow and thrive. Thomas and Alina had 4 children who would carry on the ranch legacy. Mary continued to teach, shaping young minds and making a difference in countless lives. John's horses became legendary, winning competitions and earning the respect of ranchers across the state. Martha's children visited often, bringing the energy and chaos of the city with them. Catherine's health began to fail when she was 68. It started with small things: fatigue, shortness of breath, a persistent cough. The doctor from Redemption, a young man who had trained back east, diagnosed a weak heart and told her gently that her time was limited. She might have months, perhaps a year if she was lucky. Catherine took the news with equanimity. She had lived a full life, a rich life, far beyond anything she had dared dream when she boarded that stagecoach in Boston all those decades ago. She had known love and partnership and purpose. She had raised 4 children to adulthood and watched them build their own lives. She had worked land that she owned, had created something lasting. She did not tell James right away. She could see that he knew something was wrong, but she wanted a little more time. A few more evenings on the porch watching the sunset before they had to face what was coming. Finally, one quiet morning, she told him. They were sitting in the garden she had tended for nearly 40 years, surrounded by roses and herbs and vegetables. "James, I need to tell you something. The doctor says my heart is failing. He says I do not have much time left." James's face went pale, and for a moment Catherine thought he might argue, might insist the doctor was wrong. But instead, he took her hands and said simply, "How much time?" "Months, perhaps, maybe less." Catherine tried to smile. "I am not afraid, James. I have had such a good life. I only wish we could have more time together." "I wish that too," James said, his voice rough with unshed tears. "But we will make the most of whatever time we have left." And they did. Over the next months, as Catherine grew weaker, they spent every moment they could together. Their children and grandchildren visited often, and Catherine made sure to tell each of them how proud she was, how much she loved them. She wrote letters to be given on birthdays and weddings, her final words of advice and love. One evening in late autumn, as the air turned cool and the leaves began to change, Catherine sat on the porch with James, wrapped in blankets. She could barely walk now, could barely breathe without effort, but she had insisted on coming outside one more time. "Do you remember," she said softly, "that first sunset we watched together? On the hill outside town when you asked me to marry you?" "I remember everything about that day," James said. He was holding her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. "I knew then that I would love you forever," Catherine said, "and I have. Every day through everything I have loved you." "And I have loved you," James replied. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Catherine. You changed my entire life." Catherine leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his body. She was tired, so tired, but also at peace. She had lived well. She had loved well. She had been loved in return. "What more could anyone ask from life? Thank you," she whispered. "For keeping your promise, for keeping me safe all these years." "Always," James said. "I will always keep you safe." Catherine closed her eyes, the sound of James's voice washing over her like a benediction. She thought about the frightened woman she had been, shaking on the streets of Redemption, and she wished she could go back and tell that woman not to be afraid. Tell her that everything would be all right, that running toward the unknown would lead her to everything she had ever needed. She drifted off to sleep there on the porch, held in her husband's arms, and she did not wake again. James held her through the night, whispering words of love and remembrance, and when the sun rose on a new day, he finally let their children take her from his arms. They buried Catherine on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a cottonwood tree that she had always loved. The whole county came to the funeral, and person after person spoke about how Catherine had touched their lives, her kindness, her courage, her quiet strength. Mary read a letter her mother had written, words of love and wisdom for all her children and grandchildren. Thomas and John stood with their arms around their father, holding him up as he said goodbye to the woman who had been his partner, his love, his everything. James lived for another 5 years after Catherine's death, long enough to see several more grandchildren born, long enough to know that the legacy they had built together would endure. But those who knew him well could see that a light had gone out in him when Catherine died. He had lost not just his wife but his best friend, his partner in every adventure. When James died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, they buried him beside Catherine under the cottonwood tree. On his gravestone, beneath his name and dates, they carved the words he had spoken to Catherine on the day they met. "You are safe now, I promise you." The McAllister Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through generations who remembered the story of how it all began, of a frightened mail-order bride who ran from danger straight into the arms of the man who would become her husband, her partner, her true love. They told the story to their children and grandchildren, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying moments can lead to the greatest blessings, that courage can be found in the most unexpected places, and that true love is worth fighting for. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the Texas plains in shades of orange and gold, those who lived on the ranch sometimes thought they could see two figures sitting on the hill beneath the cottonwood tree, a man and a woman side by side, watching the sunset together just as they had in life, their love enduring beyond death into eternity. The town of Redemption grew and changed over the decades, but the story of James and Catherine McAllister became part of its history, a legend told and retold. The boarding house, where Catherine had first found refuge, eventually became a historical landmark, with a plaque telling the story of the mail-order bride who found love instead of obligation. The hill where James had proposed became a popular spot for young couples, who hoped that some of the McAllisters' legendary love would rub off on them. Young Mary McAllister, named after her grandmother, grew up hearing the stories of how her great-grandmother had arrived in Redemption terrified and alone, only to build a life of love and purpose. She kept journals that Catherine had written, filled with recipes and wisdom and memories of those early days on the ranch. Those journals became treasured family heirlooms, passed down through the generations. The horses that John McAllister had bred became a recognized line, known throughout the Southwest for their intelligence and endurance. The McAllister brand, a simple M encircled by a horseshoe, was respected everywhere, a symbol of quality and integrity that traced directly back to the values James and Catherine had instilled in their children. Elena, Thomas's widow, lived to be 93, and she often told visitors about her mother-in-law Catherine, the woman who had welcomed her into the family with open arms and taught her how to survive and thrive in the harsh Texas landscape. "She was the strongest woman I ever knew," Elena would say. "Not strong like a man, but strong in her own way. She could face down any hardship and come out the other side with grace." The small house that James and Catherine had first built still stood on the ranch property, carefully maintained as a reminder of humble beginnings. Every so often, a member of the family would spend a night there, sleeping in the room where James and Catherine had shared their first years of marriage, feeling connected to the past and to the love story that had made everything possible. As the 20th century dawned and Texas continued to evolve, the McAllister Ranch adapted with it. They brought in modern equipment and techniques while still maintaining the core values that James and Catherine had established: hard work, fair dealing, respect for the land and the animals, and care for their community. The ranch became a model for sustainable ranching practices, balancing profit with stewardship. But at the heart of it all, always, was the story of two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. A woman who had run from danger, and a man who had stepped forward to help without hesitation. A love that had begun in fear and grown into something beautiful and lasting, something that would echo through the generations long after both of them were gone. And if you asked any member of the McAllister family what the most important lesson was that James and Catherine had taught them, They would tell you this. That kindness matters, that courage can be found in the smallest moments, that true love is built not on passion alone but on partnership and respect, and choosing each other every single day. They would tell you that Catherine had come to Texas expecting one kind of life, and had found something infinitely better, and that James had given up his dreams to save a stranger, and had gained everything that truly mattered in return. The cottonwood tree under which James and Catherine were buried grew large and strong, its roots deep in the Texas soil they had both loved. In spring, it bloomed with soft white flowers that drifted on the breeze like snow. In summer, its leaves provided cool shade. In autumn, it turned golden as the sun set. And in winter, its bare branches stretched toward the sky like reaching hands. And sometimes, on those rare, perfect evenings when the air was clear and the sunset painted the world in impossible colors, those who visited the graves swore they could feel something, a presence, a warmth, a sense of enduring love that had not faded with death but had instead grown stronger, more certain, eternal. Catherine Brennan McAllister had come to Texas in 1876 as a mail-order bride, shaking with fear and uncertainty. She had died nearly 50 years later as a beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and pillar of her community. And in between those two moments, she had lived a life full of love and purpose, had built something lasting with a man who had promised her safety, and had given her so much more than that. He had given her partnership, respect, devotion, and a love that would be remembered and celebrated long after both of them had returned to the earth. Their story became a reminder that sometimes the paths we think we are supposed to walk turn out to be wrong, and the detours, the moments when we run from danger or step forward to help a stranger, those are the moments that lead us to where we are really meant to be. That fear and courage are two sides of the same coin, and that the bravest thing we can do is to trust our instincts, to run when we need to run, and to open our hearts when we find someone worthy of that trust.